Well, thank you for joining us for the final panel of this fantastic conference. It's been very enjoyable to hear all the conversations so far. And I think we're looking forward to ending on a high note here. My name is Harold Trincunas. I direct the Latin America Initiative and the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. And it's my pleasure to be chairing this panel today on the prospects for foreign direct investment in Cuba, the new setting. So I think just to put things in perspective, as we heard earlier today, Cuba really has fairly large investment needs moving forward to address a number of the shortfalls that have been identified in this conference. And there's some limits to its ability to meet these shortfalls. We heard something about the limits to state revenues and therefore the state's ability to address infrastructure needs. We heard something about the limits of the ability of multilaterals to be part of the solution, both because of the issues raised by Cuba's membership or lack thereof in certain institutions, also just the limits of the available capital in multilaterals. Limits on access to global financial sort of bank lending for Cuba due to some questions about its past debt obligations. So given that scenario, I think when you look at the remaining options, foreign direct investment is really a major part of the solution. And in fact, the foreign direct investment would probably have to occur on a fairly significant scale and be sustained across quite a period of time to address some of the issues that have been raised so far today with regards to Cuba. Obviously, the U.S.-Cuba rapprochement, a major part of the reason why we're all here today to discuss these issues, has opened the door for a wider, at least exploration of the issues associated with FDI, and in fact, foreign direct investment is very much part of the discussion by international companies as well as in part, very much part of the thinking of some in the United States. Of course, we should all be wary of any irrational exuberance as we all look at the future. And I think this panel we have here today is going to help us take a very measured and sober and thoughtful look at the issues facing the prospects for a large-scale increase in foreign direct investment in Cuba. There's a number of issues that obviously will have to be addressed by the Cuban state, by the Cuban people, by foreign investors as they look at the evolution of the Cuban economy. And this includes, of course, issues associated with the legal framework for investments and for dispute resolution. It includes issues associated with the approval process for foreign direct investment and how that can be facilitated. There's labor market issues, there's productivity issues, currency, the possibility of repatriation of profits, the issues associated with past disputes over property claims, and many, many others. And I think the panel that we have for you here today is really will do a wonderful job of helping us to start thinking about these issues. And I'd like to introduce them in order. First, Professor Omar Everleni from the University of Havana. He has taught and lectured at a number of universities, not only in Cuba, but across the globe. And he's also an extremely prolific author on the Cuban economy and on international economics, including a co-author of the Cuban economy at the start of the 21st century with Jorge Dominguez and other authors. So he'll lead us off. He'll be followed by Jose Maria Vinales, who will be, he's a partner and director of international operations at the Lupicinio International Law Firm with extensive experience in corporate project finance, working with major international companies with a good deal of experience also in Cuba as a columnist for Cuba Económica and a monthly contributor for Legal Today. He will be followed by Mark Entwistle. Mark is the founding partner of Acasta Capital, who has been working on Cuban affairs and on business in Cuba continuously for 22 years in a number of different roles associated with Acasta Capital, a merchant bank based in Toronto. In the past, he was also ambassador of Cuba from 1993 to 1997, so really somebody with very deep experience looking at Cuban issues from the outside. And the final Discussant will be Augusto Maxwell, who's the chair of Ackerman's Cuba practice, extensive experience on issues related to the U.S. embargo on Cuba, particularly respect to Treasury Department's OFAC, traveled extensively in Cuba, and also has a good deal of experience teaching about Cuba as a lecturer of law at the Columbia University School of Law. So without much further ado, if I could ask Omar to lead us off. Omar, por favor.
Okay, thank you very much to Brookings, and particularly to Ted and all the participants here for providing us the opportunity to express our opinions about what's going on in Cuba with regard to direct foreign investment. I'm speaking on behalf of the University of Havana, not on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Investment. So there's some things that I would like responses or answers about some things, but for 10 years I've been answering. I've done my doctorate in foreign investment and Cuba, and so I have an idea, the good idea of the process from an academic point of view. What's been put on the table here, looking at the morning panels, Cuba has structural problems, and therefore, if there are structural problems, there has to be structural trains. If there's structural trains, there has to be investment. That is enough investment. However, there's not enough with the growth rate, which is around 5 or so percent. Foreign investment must, over the next years, has to play not a complementary role, as people you would say in the past, but it has to be fundamental with regard to investment in the country and the people. This is a very different level. They talk about relaunching foreign investment, but we forget that Cuba had foreign investment since 1992 on, and it's been growing. And what we also forget that more than 80% of the exports that come from Cuba are done by foreign companies. It's not that we're just starting from zero with the foreign investment. We have to recall, and in some of the conferences they say to me, Law 118, it doesn't have so many, it's not that different from 177. But who said that Law 177 is a bad law? Law 777, there's a lot of discretion available. What 118, Law 18 has clarified certain activities or certain amounts or certain levels of approval or certain dates, time periods for approval of businesses, but it's a law that's quite broad. What's new, what's novel about it, that the Congress, based on the guidelines from the Sixth Party Congress, has clearly said that the vitality of viewing foreign investment as an important component. It's a priority. The special development zone of Mariel, the creation, but what the document says is we're going to create areas of special areas. It wasn't just Mariel. Mariel is just the first one. There can be others created. But in my view, we can't be ambitious and think about other ones until we consolidate and solidify Mariel. It was created without we're going to have 17D, 17 December, change things, and that's going to solidify this. There has been a quickening after that day on December 17th, but before that time, there were bills submitted to begin projects that were submitted. There's priorities of the state. I don't agree that the development area of Mariel can turn it into a maquila area, an offshore assembly area. I think that's a priority, that it's not. The investments have to be in high technology and in renewable energy. I think there's certain important priorities. China almost has no presence. They're not gonna be selling to the. China's just looking for natural resources in Latin America. China has lots of sales and trade relations with these countries throughout Latin America. And we have to, this what sets China apart. It's not interested. When we talk about the special Mariel Special Development Area or Zone, remember this was during a climate where there were several factors that were in play. Cuba had to build a modern container terminal. It had to do it because the port of Havana wasn't enough. It was inadequate. Either we develop old Havana to be a tourist point, and also there were technical problems with the port of Havana. the tunnel didn't allow certain vessels to go through. This all had to be done with money, and there was a credit from Brazil for infrastructure works. We have to remember that an infrastructure work was to create a port and container terminal, but the largest world PCI from Singapore wanted to find a place for transshipment in the Caribbean. The need of Cuba, the money from Brazil, and a manager, and that's why how Mariel emerged. It was clear that from the very beginning it could operate without any relationship with the United States, because many of the American merchandise from Singapore is from America to Europe. Europe, it goes through there. If you remember, since the December 17th, remember, with all the interest of foreign companies. Now, since December 17th, there's been greater interest generated, but it's part of the development strategy of Cuba system is to have an important zone, not just any zone, but an area where there's no demands for competition. It's 400 somehow square kilometers with a priority, which is the A1 to A11 zone is the priority is on this. Everybody's working up it. When you go to, everybody went to this Maria special area. Cuba's saying this is the area we got to start working in. It said you can see four derricks and for container loading, and you should see it. Law 118. We could say it's a good law. It hasn't been as dynamic as we hoped it would be after a year after it was enacted, right? It's a bit. And actual Cuba's interest with Law 118 was to create joint ventures with 100% foreign capital, and all the companies that have come in right now are totally foreign companies. In the past, and this is the way it's been because the state realized with of the level of decapitalization that the lack of capital available to the Cuban government, and so to create a new company would be much more expensive, and so that's better to have others. So their proposal that'll be majority capital holder ownership of Cuba, the state, but in public services, but in other activities, it's not an impediment. There's no impediment, but any proposal bid is accepted, but what's being approved right now have to do with tourism and inputs because of the great demand. There is international tourism is the main thing, and as Juan was saying, 36% increase in April of tourists, of American visitors came about. That's an important figure. I don't know what they want to see in Cuba exactly. They want to see if I believe this state is being very pragmatic in its decisions and its approvals. If I was the decision maker, I would go beyond the 300 projects that have been introduced. 5 have been approved, but there are 20 that are in the final stage of approval. I'll give you a couple minutes more. These are companies that come mostly from Europe, and these are companies. I don't know if you instances have been in Cuban or they've been in the final stage and they're coming back again. I would imagine that they're to beating out other companies that could come in, with, like Unilever, which has a presence in Maria. And this company had been there had been demand for U.S. property, but so they decided on a modern company in the Mariel zone. There's also important business is being done in the area of leasing. They're not going to sell trucks, but they're going to have a company that's going to have high tonnage trucks to lease out to the companies in Mariel. This is an important role, and there's consultancies for business. The important thing about Law 118 is it enables the creation of professional service providing industries. And the surveys that have been conducted of all the companies that operate in Cuba, the first question we ask is the employer agency. If you ask me, there shouldn't be employment agency. But the employment agency under Law 118 is different from the prior agency. The employment agency is going to try to pay the worker much more than what was paid before. The law says 80% of what's negotiated with the employer can be kept by the workers themselves. Everybody knows that it's in national currencies. That's 1 to 10, and the rate of exchange is different. There's a lot of difficulties. But any worker works in is from 8 or 9, 10 than if they worked outside of the Marielito zone, and that's an incentive to want to work there. But there's a lot of difficulties. But now to wrap up, from the legal point of view, it's very important for foreign investments, but there's not enough that there's a law on the books. Cuba has to make a lot more progress with the economic elements if it doesn't have a high growth rate, if it does the dual edge sword of the currency, etc. Everything has to come together, and a more clear design, and not so much discretion in decision-making process. Thank you. Once again, I apologize for the time. Each one has 7 minutes.
Without much further ado, Jose Maria.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Brookings Institution and to TED for organizing this event. This event is it's a sign that sometimes imagination can surpass reality. If some months ago someone would have told us that we would be here talking about Cuba and how to invest in Cuba and sharing our experience in Cuba, they would have said we were crazy. But the reality sometimes is surpasses the imagination. I agree with Dr. Omar that we have to take into account, first of all, that Cuba is a planned and socialist economy that has not renounced to its socialist principles after the announcement of Obama on the 17th of December. In October 2011, there were 300 guidelines that were approved by the Socialist Party, by the Congress, the 6th Congress of the Socialist Party. Within these 300 guidelines, some major changes have happened in Cuba. For example, the private market has started. We have seen how the private market has increased from 5% to up to 20, 25% by means of the cooperatives and by means of the individual and independent entrepreneurs. Maybe for us, this would not be a major change in an economy, but for the Cubans, this has been a revolution within a revolution, because Cubans, for the first time in 50 years, some of them, they have managed to get money from their own work without being in the payroll of the state. As well, the unification of the two currencies and the protocols that are being taken into account to reach that point. Cuba is the only country in the world where there are two different currencies, and the changes between these two currencies changes. That means that there are 4 or 5 official exchange rates between CUC, peso convertible, and the local peso. And this all gives insecurity to foreign investors when they have to invest in Cuba. Within all these changes, where we have to add the special development zone of Mariel, we can talk about an island within the island, or we can talk about the Cuban Hong Kong. In Mariel, companies can have 100% of the shares of the company. Why are they doing this? For many reasons. One of them is to create a hub in the Caribbean to be able to export to smaller ports the goods that may come from the Panama Channel. Then, as well, they want to create this place where they can attract foreign technology, where they can increase the employment rates of Cuba, and as well they can depend less on the imports. We also have to take into account that Cuba imports twice as much of what they export. So that's one of their priorities as well. The new foreign investment law has been a small change if we compare it to the previous law. But this law has to be seen within within the context of changes that is happening in Cuba since 2011. As well, both the Zona Especial de Desarrollo Mariel and the new investment law, the new foreign investment law, they provide a new tax system which makes things much easier for foreign investors. During the first 8 years, foreign investors would not be paying $1 as tax for the investments and for the results coming out of the investments that they will be carrying on. Obviously, there are things that can be improved. The first one, being a lawyer, is to liberalize the legal sector, of course, and that would be a lot of legal certainty to foreign investors to have independent, private lawyers, as we can find in many other places. As well, allowing companies 100% fully owned by foreigners. It is true that within the law it is possible, but then the reality shows us that the Cuban government is reluctant to approve 100% foreign-owned companies in the island. As well, Cuba has one account system. It's like a family. They get their inputs, their cash flows, and then they get the payments they have to honor. Cuba always honors the payments, but they only have one account. So there is a list where the people, they get their number in the list, and depending on when you're in the list, you'll get paid before or after in the time. So that as well has to be changed. But as Dr. Omar may explain us later, it is important to take into account as well that Cuba doesn't have the capacity to honor foreign exchange payments because they don't have enough resources to complete and honor those payments. So they have to get into those. They have that limitation, and that is a limitation as well for foreign companies wanting to invest in Cuba. Legal certainty in Cuba is one of the points that most of the foreign investors ask us. Cuba, over the paper, is a country that has or that provides legal certainty to foreign investors. First of all, there are 62 bilateral international treaties that have been signed between the Republic of Cuba and 62 countries, including 15 European countries, by means of which any of their nationals and companies investing in Cuba, they will have the right to go to an international investment arbitration in the event there is any problem with the Cuban state. As well, there are many double taxation treaties between European countries and Latin American countries and Cuba to prevent the double taxation. Cuba is as well a signatory of the Geneva and New York Conventions. That means that they have to enforce foreign arbitrations in Cuba. Since the 1960s, Cuba has developed their arbitration system as a method for alternative dispute resolution, because they found that the courts, the magistrates, the judges, they implemented some kind of bourgeois system to resolve disputes. So since the 1960s, Cuba has been very active in arbitration, and the society in general has this experience. As well, the foreign investment law protects any nationalization from any foreign investor. And if there is any nationalization because of a major event, they'll have to compensate the foreign investor. They'll have to give him, they'll have to compensate and pay him for his investments. 1 minute. As well, there is protection in the foreign investment law against any extraterritorial effect of any other third country. So sanctions, the US sanctions would not be applicable for foreign investors in Cuba. And as well, the freedom to repatriate any money, any dividend, any benefit earned in Cuba. I would like also to take into account that according to her 20 years experience in Cuba, we have been assisting European companies to establish in Cuba, and they have already 20 years of experience ahead of any US company. The inconsistency of the sanctions and how the executive power in the United States, they have said that the sanctions, they have no use and have not been effective. And on the other side, the legislative power, having still those regulations still in place against the Republic in Cuba. What they do is to give, what they're doing is that European companies, they're going again to Cuba and they don't have limitations as the US companies have out of those windows that the OFAC has given to American companies. In this sense, the situation of the US companies right now and US investors is like being in a ship where you think that the wind never blows in the correct direction because you do not know to what port you want to go. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jose Maria. I think we'll go to Mark Entwistle next, please.
Thank you, Harold. I thought what I would do is kind of go up to about 30,000 feet, and I'm very happy to get into weeds and things on all kinds of aspects of foreign investment, but look at maybe, with your permission, 3 kinds of things. I think we need a slight romp through the history of foreign direct investment in Cuba to truly understand where the Cubans are now, and also just a few words about the kind of profile, if you will, of foreign investment in Cuba, and then some of the defining characteristics in 2015. The reason why I wanted to take just a little bit of your time on the history piece was because, in Cuba, everything is both political, but it's also fundamentally informed by history, even if people don't really quite realize that it is. And I often quasi-joke with American business people who haven't had the exposure and the experience to Cuba that Jose Maria was talking about. And when they ask, for like a single piece of advice, read a history book about the history of Cuba. Just do that to start. And a lot of what underlies Cuban approaches to public policy decisions are embedded in history. And in terms of foreign investment over the last, say, 2 decades, I think there's probably 3 major phases, if I would split them up. The years are not totally specific, but in general, from about roughly 1993 to the late 1990s, after, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union and Cuba kind of its GDP spiraled, et cetera, as we all know, there's what I would call the Wild West period. And I was there at the time. You cannot imagine all kinds of carpetbaggers, charlatans, shysters, mom and pop shops, you name it, showed up in Cuba. They formed hundreds of joint ventures. Frankly, the Cubans were at that time struggling to find some kind of lifeboat or something in the choppy waters that they were in. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, they had pulled out of that period, of course, and back from the precipice. And in terms of direct foreign investment, they entered into a period of what I broadly call kind of reassertion and reassessment. By reassertion, I mean reasserting kind of a control over the situation. They learned very powerful and painful lessons from that period in the 1990s, that not all foreign businessmen are created equal, and they learned the concept of diligence. You have to actually know who you're dealing with. Many of these companies, the foreigners had not a penny in their pocket. They came from some village in Italy or somewhere in Canada to form a pizza dough factory or whatever. And in the early 2000s, what the Cubans did, they shut down hundreds of non-performing joint ventures, cleaned up the landscape, and from that, 2 things emerged. One, a very strategic and reaches almost an obsession with dealing with large operating partners, companies that are knowable with balance sheets, that know their businesses, know what they're doing on the one hand. And during that period of roughly the 2000s, kind of stepping back from foreign investment in general, because it had been such a kind of horrific experience, focusing more on subsidization strategies, relationships with countries like Brazil, of course, the Bolivarian subsidy of Venezuela, and friendly credit terms from wherever they could get it. Bringing us up to 2014, the new Foreign Investment Law 118, which I think is an important law in the sense that in addition to its provisions, it is a political reassertion, again, of the importance of the return of Cuba to the global capital markets. I think the Cubans realized that they could not tread water forever, and the future economic development of the country did now require some modus vivendi with direct foreign investment. Interestingly, out of all that mayhem and in which of the Wild West period, when all these joint ventures, most of them failed, a few of the iconic poster boy joint ventures that if you were to have a Cuban minister here or somebody who would rhyme off a list of who the top JVs as success stories were, you have Sherritt, in nickel mining, you've got Pernod, they all come from that crazy Wild West period. But they were ones that were done properly and have been tremendously durable and sustainable. And those are companies that have long-term, obviously strategic visions of what to do in Cuba. Very briefly, we often talk about foreign investment as kind of a monolithic idea about foreign investment. What I believe, in fact, there's several faces, or maybe even what I would call personalities of foreign investment in Cuba. One, sometimes here's the word, Cuba being kind of opaque or opacity. I don't think even really that's the word that captures Cuba. Cuba has a kind of cohabitation of different realities. So inside what's called foreign investment, you've got sort of multiple players all jumbled around with each other. And it forms a kind of segmenting of the foreign investment scene. You've got what I would call the general, the ground rules are fundamentally the same. It's how you enter the playing field that's a little bit different. So you've got basic law 118. You've got the cartera, which is the long list of 246 foreign investment deals, if you will, that are being put forward. And that forms the kind of what I would call the civil framework of foreign investment. Then you've got the Mariel Special Economic Zone kind of popped over in the corner where you can have the 100% foreign-owned companies. You can have them in the mainstream economy too, but it kind of marches to its own drum, and it's got a bit of its own rhythm, and you're already starting to see tensions created between old-fashioned joint ventures in the kind of national economy and companies setting up or perceiving to set up in Mariel. Then you have another very, very specifically Cuban factor, which is a part of the economy, and this is no grand secret, which is run by military companies under a holding company called Gaesa, who have the same broad rules of engagement because they are approved by Parliament, by the legislative function. But, they march to their own drum. They tend to be companies that are extremely well-run, very efficient. So foreign investors have this kind of panoply of different portals through which to open into Cuba. Cuba's very segmented. It's segmented on currency grounds. It's segmented on property grounds. And in addition, it is segmented in a way on foreign investment. Very, very briefly, characteristics, I would say, of Cuba foreign investment in 2015. You've got a little bit of echoes now, post-December 17th of the 1990s. It's not the same. I think three big characteristics. A sense of caution that the Cubans have based on their need for diligence, not to repeat. They want the operating partners, there's that. But they're also at the same time no longer ambivalent, which you always had a feeling in past times. They're more committed for strategic policy reasons. I think the 100% foreign ownership piece is important in that. And there is greater clarity around the rules to a certain extent, although I would argue to a large extent on big ticket investment items, they have not yet been tested, but that will come. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And turning to our final panelist, Augusto Maxwell.
Great. Thank you so much, Brookings, for inviting me. This is a great experience. I've been involved in Cuba since 2003, and I take pride in having negotiated the first sale of Florida cattle to Cuba. And so I've been around this game a little bit. And obviously, the United States is not allowed to do foreign direct investment, but we've pursued all kinds of business activities that are legal. And with the December 17th announcement, as you can imagine, there was tremendous interest in this country and Miami, where I am from. I'm a proud member of the Cuban American exile community that has so imposed its will on this process. And another member of that community, Carlos Rodriguez, is here today, who is in charge of the Cuba Study Group that's done a lot of groundbreaking work in Miami trying to point to a different direction in policy. And so when these rules were announced and it was clear there was a new day, Carlos organized a meeting with the Miami Chamber of Commerce to talk about Cuba. What does it mean? What does this new perspective mean? And one of the things that I was struck by was an almost dismissive attitude about the idea that one would invest in Cuba. And folks were very knowledgeable about pointing out all the deficiencies in the Cuban economy and the Cuban law, banking system, and I was struck by that. And so my contribution was to point out that the befuddlement about how to do business in Cuba is unique to us in Miami. And my friends from Canada and Spain and other places have managed quite well to figure out how to do it. And so the burden is now on us as Americans, as Cuban Americans, and those who are interested in moving this thing forward to come up and catch up to speed. And I'm so happy that both Jose Maria, Mark, and Everleni have offered to help me, because I certainly am going to need help. The idea of foreign direct investment from the U.S. into Cuba, of course, is illegal. It's not permitted under the embargo. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is where the president's authority meets with the text of the regulations. And one example is telecommunications policy. The administration, through its discretion, has made it clear that it wants U.S. companies to invest in the telecom space and help create freedom of communication between the United States and Cuba. The challenge is that there is U.S. law that expressly prohibits U.S. investment in the Cuban telecommunication system. And so as a lawyer, we have to kind of dance around what does the word investment mean, what is the word telecommunications. And one of the things that I was struck by in conversations, public conversations by the administration, was the administration assuring U.S. companies that they, at the end of the day, are the ones that interpret the laws, and they are the ones that enforce the laws, and we're telling you it's not an investment. And any good lawyer for a company knows, well, yeah, but you might not be there tomorrow, right? And the law still will be, and someone else will read it and cause a headache for me. So one of the real challenges in this very unique space is trying to figure out what is allowed by these new licenses, what is within the discretion of the president, and what, in fact, can I, as a lawyer, sign off on after reviewing the embargo regulations. And I think for the most part, discretion is the better part of valor, and you're not going to see heavy foreign direct investment until you see changes to U.S. law. And as a matter of fact, you have that right now. One of the bills that have been introduced in Congress today would clarify this telecom issue, right? It leaves the embargo in place. We're not talking about lifting the embargo. We're just clarifying that a U.S. telecom company can indeed set up a phone system or pursue an investment on the island. So that, I think, is really the state of play, if you will, domestically on the U.S. side between what is legal and what is still prescribed by the embargo. Oh, there you go.
And if Mark and Jose can turn off the button on the left, so it's the perfect.
So foreign direct investment by the U.S. is going to go through a very different process. First is going to be the idea of changing the embargo regulations to allow it. That said, there's another set of concerns that I think are going to affect U.S. investment on the island in a way that doesn't affect our friends from Canada and Spain, and that is that there is a large, vociferous Cuban-American community that is looking over the shoulders of all that investment taking place in Cuba. And so that which U.S. investment in China or U.S. investment in Africa or South America doesn't have the same audience or constituency that U.S. investment in Cuba will have, particularly first movers. And so that's going to be a whole other layer that an American company owes to itself to make sure that it does its due diligence, both with government relations and public relations, to properly execute a strategy with respect to Cuba. And I would highlight two issues, or three perhaps, that should be on the radar. One is the issue of claims, right? Confiscated claims. I won't get into the technical conversation, but there's these certified claims that were go to U.S. companies that went through a process. And the other is Cuban national claims by folks like myself who lost a few things in the revolution. As I think about it objectively, sometimes I think, wow, that's a big problem over there. Other times I think about it and I don't think it's going to be a problem at all, but it's something that needs to be vetted. The second significant problem that needs to be thought through is the point that Dr. Everlenny pointed out, which is there's one Cuban employment agency, right? So if I'm an American company, I need to explain that I've hired X number of Cubans and I'm paying the Cuban government $100 and they're only making a fraction of that. Now there are workarounds and other things that might justify that, but that doesn't look right, and it's going to be difficult for many American companies to think that through. And finally, there's the issue of the Cuban government itself, particular members of the government, and do they really own the business or not? And so those are the kinds of issues that I think are going to be slightly different for American companies moving forward, because they're going to have a domestic audience that some of these other foreign partners don't quite have. And with that, my comments are done.
Well, thank you very much to our panel. Despite what appears to be my ruthless timekeeping, we in fact just have 25 minutes left for Q&A, and I know we have a very interested audience. So I think I'm just going to pass directly to Q&A from the audience. Again, please raise your hand, and I'll put you on the list. And if you could wait for the microphone before asking your question, and please identify yourself when you ask your question. So I think I have one here already in the front row, and another one, third, okay.
Yes, sir. Hello. It's good? Okay. Rafael Betancourt from Havana Consulting. Mark spoke about greater due diligence on the part of the Cuban government in selecting foreign investment partners now than in the 90s. There's one important change in the corporate world between the 90s and now, and that's the importance of corporate social responsibility. And yet I have not seen in any of the new legislation or in the Cuban declarations any mention of corporate social responsibility and how it could be an added contribution of a foreign partner in partnering with Cuba. So I'd like your opinion on that topic.
Oh, sorry, Rudy.
Let's maybe take a round of 3 questions, and then we'll come back to the panel on that. So I think there was immediately adjacent to you, and then there was one further back.
David Lewis with Manchester Trade. One question and a quick comment from the previous session. For the lawyers, your interpretation of communications technologies in today's world, media, TV, film, because the tradition is that it's just phone calls, which of course used to be landlines. Now it's cellular, which means anything that's floating. So I think that's going to be a challenge. And just a comment on the previous panel, take Under Secretary Selig to task on questions. We already have various cases of large U.S. companies with allowed sales of goods allowed under the 12, and all of a sudden say, well, listen, you need to pay a customs broker in Havana, like you do in any country in the world. And a customs broker in Havana is a state. So, you know, in order to sell and distribute the 2 million goods of construction material to private citizens, which is allowed, it needs to pass customs. I need to pay $30,000. It's a legitimate amount. It's what it costs. And basically what Commerce says is, send us the requests. We may have to look at it and do an interpretation. So that's what this process is going to be, because the easy part is get on a plane and travel. That's easy. The hard part is all these little other areas. So, you know, that's what you have government officials for. They're going to have to look at that case by case and answer.
And then one more here, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Manuel Gomez from Progreso Semanal. I'm a private consultant,
Gomez.
primarily to our last panelist, but to anyone else who may answer. And I recognize it may be an unfair question because it not may be the expertise of this panel, but would you comment on the chances of the telecom legislation that you mentioned, what the prospects might be?
Okay, and so that we have a question on social responsibility, a couple questions on the telecommunications sector and telecommunications law, and a question on the sort of the nuances of the relationship that will have to be resolved if the proceeds. So if any of you would like to jump in, we'll just go down the panel and answer. Don't feel need to answer everything, just focus on what you'd like to intervene on.
Realmente la ley no especifica.
Well, the law doesn't specify that companies have a social responsibility, but taking into account how businesses are approved in Cuba with the involvement of authorities that deal with the environment, etc., I imagine that even though it is not mentioned in the law, where we talk about respect for certain elements that is necessary, I think it will be taken into account. I think it's better to arrive late, but to actually get there. And if this is going to, and it's going to help us to know what other companies have gone through, and we're just getting started in Cuba. And I agree with you that it should be there. What I wouldn't be too sure would be that the state would actually forget about this. I think this is something that will be included.
With Dr. Omar. When negotiating the clauses of a joint venture company or getting a business approved in Cuba, it goes through different stages of approvals and diligence studies. And normally in the articles of association and in the general business agreement, it's taken into account all these points, environmental issues, and as well any potential liabilities that the business may have regarding the society or the environment. The new law has a chapter only focused on the environmental issues as well. So that's important to take into account as well. And as well, the Cubans normally are 51% of the share stake of the company. So they will be taking into account all these matters during the life of the company. And in addition to this, the company and the business has to be approved by either the Council of the State, either the Council of Ministers, or the chief of the specific organism within which the business is involved. So, for example, if it's the Ministry of Industry or the Ministry of Agriculture, etc. So they're always looking after the business, not only when it is approved, but also in the day-to-day of the business. Regarding telecommunications and any other imports that may be coming from the United States, I was as well surprised by the announcements in January, because it appeared that they didn't take into account the Cuban reality. Obviously, the only companies that can import goods, not only from the States, but from any other country, are state-owned companies or joint venture companies, which are 51, 49%. There are some exception of companies that are 100% owned by foreign investors that have the licenses to import specific goods. But all the companies that are importing, for example, from the United States, can be summarized in one, which is the all import, as we said before. So you're always dealing with the Cuban state. As well, it is difficult to sell from an individual entrepreneur to the United States potential clients any service that is a tangible asset. I mean, you can always sell a translation, You can always sell an accountancy service, or you can always sell an English class or a Spanish class from Cuba. But it's difficult to sell any art or any furniture or whatever is produced in Cuba, because you will have to pass through a public company. And then about telecommunications, Cuba has recognized that they need to import around 1 million computers. But obviously all those computers and all that technology, all those goods would be used for the public sector or for the public-private sector in these joint venture companies and businesses. So as well, you'll be passing through the state. And in Cuba, they have an infrastructure problem with the telecommunications, as it happened with the telephones in the 90s. They have still digital technology or infrastructures, and they have to adapt it to analogic. So even if we wanted to give internet to all the Cubans in the island, there should be major investments in infrastructure so that it can reach all those homes. Right now in Cuba, the 1 megabyte of internet per month has a cost of $180. If we take into account that an average Cuban earns around 25 to 35 US dollars, that is a small treasure for them. Additionally, they have Nauta rooms that they want to develop, and they want to open 136 Nauta rooms, which is navigation rooms, which are rooms where they have 4 to 5 computers, and they charge $4 US per hour of internet. And there are now 200 navigation rooms, and they want to increase it to 400 navigation rooms. So, I mean, that's a major sector that both the American, the US government, and the Cuban government want to be developed, but they have to see all those small engineering things to make things happen.
I just add one little piece on the CSR question, and I'll leave all the legal stuff to Gus. Totally agree with Omar and Jose Maria about the way to the extent it's not explicitly covered, but the extent it's dealt with, it's inside of the approvals process, et cetera, et cetera. The one thing I would add, foreign companies nowadays, inbound companies, American, Canadian, whatever, have a CSR component now almost invariably. And in the olden days, for any of you who have were around in Cuba, say, in the 90s or something, there used to be an old ministry called MINVEC, which was the Ministry for Foreign Collaboration, who were highly politically sensitive to humanitarian, CSR stuff, because of a sense that the state should not be embarrassed because it can't supply services to its own people. That was very much the prevailing kind of political wind at the time. That's all gone. There's a CSR, there's a strong CSR and community engagement piece in almost everything they do. Sherritt runs huge community development programs, and all companies do.
Yeah, to touch on your earlier comment that technology and communications have evolved, I had the privilege of representing Airbnb on its launch of its services in Cuba. And so there are things that the current law allows. They're, I think, pretty significant and revolutionary, and I'm very happy to have helped with that. But the other issue of I'm going to invest in a telecom system, it used to be that the law focused on an American company's ability to connect the United States to Cuba, and that was okay. But then the idea that the United States would invest in diffusing that signal within Cuba was forbidden. And what the administration is now saying, no, that's okay. You can invest on the Cuba side to diffuse the signal. And I think that that's where the debate is, and I think that that's where that legislation hopes to accomplish. I'm not in the political risk game but I think there are a lot of things that indicate that type of legislation has much better chance than it did, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. I think in the U.S. you're seeing a confluence now that's growing on the Republican side, in particular, to kind of engage with Cuba to see potential opportunities, and they have organized themselves with some, I think, significant players and efforts. And so I think that the idea that perhaps lifting the travel ban would be first, and perhaps clarifying the telecom legislation, I think those are two things that bear watching, because I think the prospects are much more favorable than they would have been 2 years ago.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for another round of questions, and I have Andres, and if any of you, yes, Chantal, and then, okay, I'll keep a list, just raise your hand, but we'll start with Andres. Right here.
I'm Andres Van Hoel. I was born in Cuba. I'm a Cuban-American businessman, and I'm an investor, invest in foreign countries, and it's great to see Cuba now becoming an area that we're talking about. Ted, I think 4 years ago, we would have never thought we would have been where we are today at the table talking about foreign investment. You know, investment in any foreign country is not a perfect world. We go in with a lot of reservations, a lot of issues, and we all have criteria to invest in whatever country we want to invest in. But I see Cuba going through what I would call an evolution of the revolution, if you want to call it, where you know, they're opening up the relations to the U.S. or becoming closer, U.S. closer to Cuba. It's not without issues. It's not without criticisms. But it's something that I think is closer, and I think it's good. It's also good for U.S. businesses to be involved more in Cuba, as it is for American people to be able to visit Cuba. It creates a relationship between the people, which is very important. You all brought up so many issues. Your presentations are all excellent. But at the end of the day, there's always limitations on this, but the biggest limitation we all face on foreign investment is the U.S. embargo. And really, that question that I want to ask each of you, I guess, separately is the embargo not an embargo on U.S. businesses and U.S. companies and U.S. individuals from visiting Cuba like you can elsewhere in the world?
Thank you. Thank you, Andres. I will take Chantal's question, and if anybody else wants to jump in on this round, raise your hand.
Thank you.
Then we'll come back to the panel.
Chantal Agarwal with the American Bar Association. I wanted to follow up on Jose Maria's recommendation for liberalization of the legal sector. What are the prospects for legal profession reform in Cuba? Because as I understand it, lawyers currently work through what is known as these bufetes colectivos. And what are the prospects? Is it a short, medium, or long-term endeavor? Thank you.
Anybody else in this? Okay. Carlos, do you want to? I think right here on this.
Oh.
My question is for Augusto. You mentioned that you were involved in facilitating some of the contacts or the legal background with Airbnb. Could you just describe a little bit more, share a little bit more about how that came about? And, you know, because I see it really, as I mentioned in my presentation, as a model of success, and one of the few areas where we can say it was a win-win-win-win in terms of, you know, Cuban entrepreneurs, you know, U.S. customers, Cuban government, and the U.S. government. And I'd love to see that replicated, so I'm interested to know how it happened.
All right. I think if we can just go back to the panel, maybe we'll start with Augusto at this end and then come back and then end with you.
Well, Airbnb is, it was a wonderful experience to meet an incredibly talented, intelligent group of young people who see the world in a quite different way and saw an opportunity. Their model was tailor-made for this opportunity. It doesn't require them to build anything on the island. They had in the past received requests from Cubans to rent their houses on the Airbnb platform, and there was some lawyer somewhere in San Francisco that says you can't do that. It's illegal, right? The embargo prohibits an American person from any transaction in which a Cuban has an interest, direct or indirect, unless licensed, and there was no license to do it. And so when December 17th came along, they looked at the new general TSP and said, wait, I think this is legal. We don't have to affirmatively block a Cuban from using our site. We went down to the island, did our due diligence, did what we thought was necessary here in DC and in Havana, and gave them legal advice, and it was really, launched the button. They also were able to take advantage of the fact that there were already existing workarounds, sort of mini Airbnbs in Spain and some other countries. And so Airbnb, in essence, kind of rolled them up like any other bigger name brand company might. And so those are the bigger stories. I think payment's always going to be a challenge because today we don't have direct banking relations between the United States and Cuba. I joke that my role with American companies is akin to the Larry Fishburne character in The Matrix. I walk off a building, I say, you can do this. You can do this with Cuba. And they're like, no, you're ridiculous. I can't walk off this building. And so it is with banking. Banks have not taken that next step. And so the Airbnb model and others have to triangulate or work around with all these rigmaroles that add a huge inefficiency to the system.
I won't deal with the lawyers of stuff or Airbnb, but the only piece I'd mention to Andres' question, and I'm not an American, but I do find I spend a lot of time in the United States, especially after December 17th, with your companies. There can be a sense that Cuba's kind of an empty vessel to be filled up, and we just got to wait a little bit to kind of go over there. I would take this opportunity to remind everybody it's a very hustly, bustly place with a lot of people, still there. And if there's one characteristic of Cuban economic development policy that I've certainly noted is a diversification of reliance. It's no accident that at the same time that that all the U.S.-Cuba stuff was unfolding, feverish activity was going on with the Europeans to redo the European Union political relationship. The Japanese foreign minister was there. The president of France came, of course. The Koreans. Korea doesn't even have diplomatic relations with Cuba. They gave the Central Bank of Cuba, it's not huge, but it's €60 million line of credit. So all I am saying is that, to go to Andres' point, in a way, American companies are caught in a very awkward, kind of bizarre place right now. I just stop there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess American companies, they're stuck in, as well, what I said before, I referred to the ship that everybody's unhappy because it never blows in the correct direction, because they don't know where they're going. So no one's happy. If we compare it to the situation that the Europeans have, they can invest in Cuba. But when we have developed the projects, and for example, we have been quite busy with a biomass project, where the EPC company is a Chinese company listed in China, and the developer is a British company. It was extremely difficult to get the security package in place, and it was almost impossible to get any financing coming from any bank, any foreign bank, because the U.S. embargo, although if it applies to U.S. persons, it has extraterritorial effects, and that is a fact. What happened is that European companies that had presence or that had interests in the United States, they were afraid in doing businesses in Cuba. Or those companies that wanted to open the North American market, the US market, they wouldn't do any business in Cuba. But after the 17th of December announcement, many companies have been asking us to do business in Cuba because, as per the contradiction or the inconsistency within the US, and taking into account that it is normally the executive power, the one implementing the extraterritorial effect of the sanctions out of the country, is normally the Secretary of State department, then they were less afraid of getting any extraterritorial effects. So they're now more willing to invest in the island. And they have this interregnum, they have this period of time until there is a waiving of the US sanctions by the Congress, if there is, after 2016, to get in the island, do the investments, and have a stronger position towards any North American company that wants to invest. Brazilians, Mexicans, Chinese, Vietnamese, Angolan, Spaniards, British, Italians, French. They have been doing businesses for the past 20 years in Cuba. So that's one point. What would I recommend to American companies right now? I would recommend them to protect their intellectual property rights in Cuba. There is a registry. You can register your company names, trademarks, etc. So that when you get to Cuba in the future, you won't see someone else drinking Coca Cuba instead of Coca-Cola. That's one point. The other thing we recommend to our U.S. clients is to go there in one of those 12 categories, the one regarding market research, etc., and talk to the potential counterparties, the Cuban parties that would be negotiating, that would be their clients, that would be their partners, and see what they want, what they need, etc. And as well, to talk to the foreign companies that have been doing business in Cuba for the past 20 years to see the pros and cons and what exactly have been their challenges. Then regarding the legal profession, very briefly, it is true that the Cuban lawyers, they're either in companies, they either work for the state, the ones that are practitioners, or they are in firms, legal firms. These firms, they are either directly belong to the Ministry of Justice or through the Asociación de Bufetes Colectivos, indirectly belong to the Ministry of Justice. So the profession is not privatized and it's not liberalized. This means that at the end of the day, the Cuban lawyers, they are in the payroll of the Cuban state, which means that any foreign company, as for example Unilever, which we have the privilege to represent in the Zona de Mariel, when they have to engage their Cuban lawyer, they have, they're engaging someone that at the end of the day is in the payroll of their counterpart, which is the Cuban state. So that's one point. If there was a possibility to privatize and liberalize the profession, it would be within one of the cooperative licenses, which means that you need at least three individuals, and they can start up a business. But for that, they would need a license. And until that comes up, they won't be able to develop their profession. It's not in the short, I would say, in the agenda right now, but it may come in the mid and long term, because to grant legal certainty to foreign investors, they would need to have lawyers that work only for them and do not have any kind of direct or indirect conflict of interest.
Bueno, muy rápido, para contestarle.
Quickly to answer, Andres, I'm gonna make us. Cuba is on the first floor. The U.S. is on the second floor. I'm gonna make a simile, and then there's a stair, and we're going up the stairs. And when we get to the end, the top, we have to eliminate one of the stairs that's missing, because that's the embargo, because that prevents us from getting to the economic conditions that we need. But also, we shouldn't grow desperate. We have to remember it's only 4 months since the 17th of December. And so I believe that the history, as the ambassador says, history shows that not everybody is prepared for such a rapid response. It requires time. It has to sink in, and it's got to be gradual. People have to change their mindset, and there are people that won't. Everything takes time. But what I'm sure of, rest assured, everyone, events like this will make it possible to create the necessary public opinion to know that a hindrance that blocks, that it's the embargo that's keeping us. That's one of the things that have stood in the way the most up till now. And there have been timid attempts, but it requires the letters of intention and interest that's been showed. Shows us that there's been interest in Cuba, and so this response is dialogue. It's Cuba hasn't set up an embargo against the U.S. It's the other way around. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Arrived at the end of our time, and thank you to all our panelists and to our audience for joining us. And Ted Picon gets the last word.
Great. Well, it would really be impossible to summarize what we heard today. It's incredibly rich, and I want to thank everyone who participated. Thank you for all your wisdom and thoughts. Let me just give some very quick reflections. When I step back and think about where we are and what we heard today, it sounds to me like a dance of two elephants, where they have, on one hand, they're stuck in their own places where they come from. In the case of the United States, we're stuck in a place called the embargo. There's a reason for the embargo. There's a lot of history behind it, but we are clearly stuck. And then the Cubans have a certain model, a socialist model, that they're trying to adapt to the new 21st century economy, but it comes with a lot of problems and a lot of challenges, and we heard about those in great detail. So the question is, how do you then get to something that's different, that's going to change? And it seems to me that what the solutions on the table are really incremental, and it's going to take time. And so you see the big challenges that we've all heard about today, and then you come down to reality and you see what are a set of really rather incremental changes. And that's a bit schizophrenic and frustrating, but I feel like that's what we're taking away in the current situation. We heard from Juan Triana certain important takeaways around the macroeconomic trends, somewhat optimistic, looking at, say, a year or two from now. Let's see how that all plays out, whether it's in the tourism area, banking, foreign direct investment. But we also heard from our second panelists, especially Yaima and Saida, the real challenges on the front of fiscal revenue, tax structure, the basic incentives of the economy, the problem of wages and productivity. And will Cuba decide to kind of leapfrog ahead on the technology front, for example, or again, for the protection of its model, move very slowly and cautiously and be kept, I think, perhaps a little bit behind from where it could be. We also heard about the microeconomic trends, the cooperatives, the cuentapropistas, what's happening in the services sector. A lot of interesting movement in those fields and a lot of hope. But in the end of the day, it's still the microeconomy. It's very small, and it's not really having the impact that Cuba needs to move ahead. We heard then about the role of the international community, both, of course, the United States with Stefan Selig in the beginning, what the president has been able to do, what Congress now could do, needs to do, very important looking ahead. But we also heard, importantly, about the Europeans and the Canadians and their experience on the island, way ahead of the United States. But we also did not hear as much about the role of countries like China and Venezuela, maybe Mexico going forward, Brazil, of course, very important players in moving Cuba into a whole new place in the world. I think the discussion about the role of CAF from Germán Trios is important to see an international financial institution come to the table and begin to engage more directly, and that's a very positive sign, I think, of what's underway. But at the end of the day, you have a situation on the ground that feels constrained, but with lots of windows of opportunity, and I think kind of your analogy about from the Matrix of kind of going off on a ledge is what's required here, some risk-taking to help move that forward. I want to, in particular, give thanks to Harold Chincunas, who's the director of our Latin America work and has been very supportive of all of our work on Cuba. I don't see Ashley Miller. Here she is in the back. Ashley is my research assistant who has made all of this happen. I can't tell you enough. All the details that go into bringing our Cuban visitors here, travel and everything else, it's always very complicated, but very rewarding. Also, Emily Miller, who's been helping behind the scenes. Special thanks to Richard Feinberg, who has really been the intellectual leader of our work on Cuba, and I rely on him a great deal for his wisdom and advice. Can I just ask you that you bring your headsets out to the desk when you walk out, any kind of garbage so that things don't spill on the floor, and we'll have transcripts online as soon as we can get them up, written, audio, and video, and look forward to seeing you again. Thank you for coming.